When your best friend loses all autonomy just to serve your own purpose, is that still love? There's a line in Obsession that stuck with me the entire night. Just because you made that decision for someone doesn't make it any less real. And that idea alone turns this from a simple premise into something way more unsettling. On the surface, this plays like a creepy escalating horror film, but underneath that, there's a lot going on here about control, entitlement, and what happens when you try to force something that was never yours to begin with. And honestly, I walked out kind of obsessed with it. So I caught this at the Florida Film Festival last month. And this was one of those screenings where you could feel the room reacting together. The laughs hit, the uncomfortable moments really hit, and as these things started escalating, you could feel the tension building across the entire audience. It was a fantastic theatrical experience, and that absolutely added to it. The story follows Bear, who's stuck in that emotional space a lot of people understand, where you have feelings for someone, but you just can't say it. And instead of taking the risk, instead of being honest, he rehearses it, overthinks it, delays it, and ultimately looks for a way around it. And that's where the movie makes its turn, because instead of dealing with reality, he makes a wish. And what he gets is technically exactly what he asked for. But the movie doesn't treat it like a victory, it treats it like a removal of something essential. Because Nikki just doesn't fall in love with him, she loses herself. And that's where the film becomes something else entirely. What starts as an awkward, even kind of funny at times, slowly transformed into something deeply disturbing. Not just because of how she acts, but because of what it represents. This isn't just obsession in the traditional sense. This is somebody being stripped of autonomy and forced into a role they never chose. And what really makes the movie work is that it understands that. There are some genuinely heartbreaking moments with Nikki as all of this unfolds. And the film takes its time letting those moments breathe. It's not just about what's happening on the surface, it's about what's disappearing underneath it. That's where the emotional side of the film really landed for me. And suddenly, everything flips, because now she's not the source of the horror, she's the victim of it. And looking back, she always was. We just didn't fully understand how much until that point. That's also where Bear becomes really interesting as a character, because the movie never treats him like a traditional villain. He's not operating out of cruelty. He's not waking up every morning trying to hurt somebody. In his mind, this was something small, something that would simply help him avoid rejection. And that's the tragedy of it. He chose control over honesty. He chose a shortcut instead of vulnerability. And the result is that he doesn't just lose the version of Nikki he wanted. He loses the real version of her entirely. And that's the emotional core of the movie. This isn't about gaining love. It's about destroying the very thing that made love meaningful in the first place. There's also a really strong layer involving the relationships surrounding them. Bear becomes so hyper-focused on what he wants that he completely loses sight of the emotional reality around him. The people in his life have their own feelings, their own struggles, their own connections, and he's so consumed by this fantasy that he stops seeing people clearly. And when things begin falling apart, it doesn't just damage one relationship, it damages all of them. That's where the escalation in the film really worked for me, because it's not simply getting more intense visually. The emotional consequences continue stacking on top of each other until the entire thing starts collapsing under its own pressure. I also want to talk about the tone, because this is where a lot of horror films lose control. There's dark comedy throughout the movie. There are moments that genuinely got laughs out of the audience, but the film never lets you settle into comfort for too long. Every time it starts feeling playful, it drags you back into something unsettling. And by the time the horror elements fully take over, it doesn't feel like a tonal shift. It feels like the inevitable destination. Visually, there are some really smart decisions too. There's recurring use of shadow and lighting around Nikki where she's framed almost separately from the world around her. Like she's slowly becoming disconnected from herself. It's subtle but incredibly effective. And honestly, for a first feature, that's impressive. Which brings me to Curry Barker. This is his first feature film, and when you realize this thing was reportedly made for under $1 million, it becomes even more impressive because the movie feels controlled, confident, focused. It doesn't feel like a first-time filmmaker trying to imitate somebody else's style. It premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, and it reportedly ended up getting picked up by Focus Features and Blumhouse Productions for somewhere around $14 to $15 million. That kind of jump doesn't happen unless people see something real here. In watching the movie, you understand why. There's a clear understanding of tension, restraint, pacing, and the film doesn't overcomplicate itself. It trusts the premise and lets the emotional discomfort carry the story. Now, I will say there were definitely people around me at the festival who didn't fully buy into Bear as a character. Some thought he came off too whiny or too immature, too emotionally invest in. And honestly, I understand that reaction, but my takeaway was different. I don't think Bear fully believes this novelty piece is actually real either. I think he's naive, emotionally misguided, and operating from insecurity more than malice. To him, it almost feels like a harmless fantasy or a shortcut around rejection. And I actually think that makes the film more unsettling. Because by the time he realizes the consequences are real, he's already destroyed something he can't undo. There are also comparisons you can make to something like The Craft, where supernatural forces are used to manipulate love and attraction, but the difference here is that Obsession builds its entire identity around that concept. This isn't a side storyline. This is the movie, and more importantly, the film fully commits to the consequences of that idea. It never backs away from it. It never softens the emotional damage just to make the audience feel better. It lets the discomfort sit there, and I think that's why the film works as well as it does. Because by the end, this no longer feels like a gimmick or a clever horror premise. It feels like a statement, a pretty uncomfortable one. So yeah, Obsession ended up being one of the biggest surprises for me at the Florida Film Festival. It's creepy, layered, emotionally messy in the right ways, and it escalates into something that feels earned instead of manufactured. And honestly, I think this might be one people continue talking about for a while. Not just because of what happens in the movie, but because of what the movie is actually saying underneath all of it. That's why it stayed with me walking out of the theater. Appreciate you going on this film journey with me, and as always, be real.
Is her love real?
Just because you chose this for her doesn't make it less real.